Welcome to BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
All right, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to our course that we are starting for the next 8 weeks. And this course is Sheroes of Resistance, the Women Who Fought Back. It is an African history course completely devoted to activists and freedom fighters and female rulers and common people and working class people who all have in common over the millennia of history that we're going to go over the next 8 weeks, the fact that they fought against various forms of oppression, whether that was external oppression such as imperialism or invasions or colonialism or neo-colonialism, or whether we're talking about internal oppression within black communities or within nations. These women across the African world fought and they resisted and they organized and inspired others. So these are the type of women that we're going to be looking at, and it's not an exhaustive list. There are so many stories that we can tell and recount to others. So we just picked a few major figures, some that you may have heard of, some that you may know a little bit about, but not everything, and some people you may not have heard about at all, and you'll learn about them. So just like with all our courses, we'll meet here every Saturday at 11, except for next Saturday. And I'll make an announcement about that next. We won't have a session next week. But we'll pick up the week after that. We meet every Saturday at 11. We talk for about an hour. For those of you that are new to our sessions, I lecture for about 25 to 30 minutes. Then we have a recorded Q&A because this entire session is recorded. So that way we can put it on our course website. And if you miss a week, you can watch it again. So we have a recorded Q&A after the first half of class. Then I go back and lecture some more, another 25, 30 minutes. And then we turn the recording off and we have open discussion, make community announcements, discuss current events, anything people want to bring up. So we go for about an hour, good discussion, anything that you want to look up more information on. We have an entire course website dedicated to resources on the women and the movements and the ideas that we're going to be talking about. And that course website is updated all the time. The recordings from previous lectures, because we've been doing this class since 2018. So this is the 2018, 19, 20, 21, 22. This is the 5th cycle of this course that Jaku Combat has been putting on since 2018. So we're glad that you're sticking with us. And if you're new, welcome. We're broadcasting from BIA Media at 235 Montreal Road, as you saw in the graphic at the beginning. So again, this partnership is growing. We are doing this for the community. We aren't making any money off of this. It's all for the community. It's all for you all. Please utilize this space. Get in contact with BIA Media for any projects that you may have. Podcasting, photography, videography. It's all available. It's all here for you. Use these services. Let's support our own and our community. So let's get right into it because we always have to start our courses. So the last time we met, we were in a 4-week seminar. Our seminars are a little different than our courses. So we had our seminar in Nigeria for 4 weeks. This is an 8-week course, and we start our 8-week courses always with a pre-assessment to talk about the information. But before we get into that, I always like to dedicate these courses to an ancestor. And this course is dedicated to Dr. Edna Beatrice Chappelle McKenzie. Dr. McKenzie was a trailblazing activist, educator, and reporter in Pittsburgh, where I'm from. She even taught my father African American history in college at the Community College of Allegheny County. And my father says that she was one of the people that really encouraged him take his education seriously. And she was an advocate for Black history. She was one of the first. She was the first full-time female reporter for the Black newspaper in Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Courier, and she just did a lot. Over 2 years ago, my father and I started a book drive for Black churches, the Hill District, the Black section of Pittsburgh, one of the Black sections of Pittsburgh, and we named it after her because she was all about getting this information out to as many Black folks as possible. So I honor Dr. McKenzie by dedicating this course session to her. So we start our sessions, since she was an educator, I'm an educator, the importance of assessment, the importance of testing what we know, and then at the end, we'll do a post-assessment to see if folks learned anything new. So I'm gonna ask you about 8 questions, and I want you to write down your answers. And I'm going to ask you similar questions toward the end of our class and see if you have increased your score. So if you've taken this course with us before, you should get a lot of this right. There's not a lot of new things on this post test if you've taken this course before. If it's new to you, don't feel bad if you don't know anything, because much of this stuff isn't taught in school. So there's no way that you can know what you don't know. But by the end of the course, you should know these things, or else I haven't done my job as an educator. So don't feel bad if you don't know anything. If you've taken this course before, let's see if your score has increased, if you remember what you were taught last time. So just write down the correct answer. I'll give everyone the correct answer once we are through with each question. So, number 1, who was the Shero who used mostly nonviolent tactics? And I have mostly there because she did something a little tiny bit violent, but most of her tactics were nonviolent to resist British colonialism in Kenya. So this is in the early 20th century. Was it Nehanda? Was it Ranavalona I? Was it Ranavalona VII? Was it Mikatalili Wamenza? Or was it E, or none of the above? And if you think it's E, and you write down the actual name of the person, I'll give you a point extra credit. You can mark a point for extra credit on your whatever you're recording this on. So I'll give folks a couple of seconds to think about this. My bad. Okay, all right. Sorry about that. A little technical thing we had to deal with. Let's move on to number 2. And I'll go back to these at the end. Which of the following tactics were used by Nanny of the Maroons, in her battles against the British in Jamaica? So we're not just picking on the British. We're going to pick on a bunch of other people. So don't think these are all about the British. But what tactics were used by Nanny, the only female heroine among Jamaica's national heroes? Did she use guerrilla warfare? A. B. Spiritual science. C. Oath making. D. Diplomacy. E. All of the above. Or F. None of the above in her struggles against the British? What tactics did Nanny use in her struggles? A, B, C, D, E, or F? Take a couple of seconds, choose your answer. All right, moving on to number 3. Who led the kingdom of Ndongo in its resistance to the Portuguese in modern-day Angola during the 17th century? Was it A, Ya Santiwa, B, Queen of Shetset, C, Queen Taitu, D, Queen Ranavalona, or E, none of the above. And if you think it's none of the above, you can write the correct answer for 1 point extra credits. We're looking for the name of this female leader who led the kingdom of Ndongo, which is in modern day Angola. She fought against the Portuguese. See, I told you, I'm not going to pick on the British the entire time. Who was this leader? A, B, C, D, or E? And if you think it's, you know the answer. You think it's E, you can write down the name. Take 5 more seconds. All right. Who led the Merina Kingdom in Madagascar in its struggle against European colonization? She also defeated the French and the English at the Battle of Tamatave. Was it A, Ya Santiwa? It was almost the same choices. B, Queen of Shetset. C, Queen Taitu. D, Queen Rana Valona. Or E, none of the above. And again, if you think it's E, write the name for extra credit. Who was this leader in Madagascar? Oftentimes we think about African history, we forget Madagascar is a part of Africa, even though it's an island, but it has African culture, it's part of African history. We should know what happened in that island. So which one of these female leaders defeated both the English and the French in one of the most famous naval battles in African history that you should know about? Take 5 more seconds. All right. Who was the first woman to lead troops in the U.S. Army, but was denied her full pension by the U.S. government? This woman led, the first woman on record, black, white, whatever, to lead U.S. troops into battle. Was it A, Condoleezza Rice? Was it B, Mariah Stewart? C, Anna Julia Cooper? D, Harriet Tubman? Or again, was it none of these women and it's somebody else who's not on this list? If you think it's E, write down that name and you'll get 1 point extra credit. Which one of these women was it? 5 more seconds. All right. Nehanda Charwe of Zimbabwe, Kimpavita and Kimpavita of the Congo, and Queen Muhamusa of Rwanda relied primarily, so they used other tactics, but they relied primarily on what to lead rebellions against colonialism? Was it A, political power, B, military power, C, spiritual power, D, their daughters, or E, their sons in their rebellions against various colonial powers? In Zimbabwe, it was the British. Kimpa Vita, it was against the Portuguese. In the Congo, and with Muhumuza, it was against the Germans and the English and the Belgians. She fought against a number of colonizers. What was their primary weapon of choice? Take 5 more seconds. All right. Last one. Which of the following were tactics of the Igbo Women's War of 1929? So we had just finished our seminar on Nigerian history and we talked about Igbo land. This happened outside of the historical scope of what we were discussing, but it goes back to those ideas that we were engaged in when we talked about Igbo land, the importance of women and women's control of the market. And we'll talk about the Igbo Women's War of 1929. What did they do during that war? Did they loot factories? Did they burn down native court buildings? Did they block train tracks? Did they release prisoners from colonial jails? Did they do all of these things, or did they do none of these things? What do you think? A, B, C, D, E, or F? Which tactics were used during the Igbo Women's War? Take 5 more seconds, and I'll go backwards for us to discuss these. All right. Actually, no, I'll go back to the beginning. Let's go through them. All right, number 1. The Shero that used nonviolent tactics to resist the British. If you chose D, Mika Talili Wamenza, you were correct. And we're going to talk about her in a few weeks. Mika Talili Wamenza was the Shero that used nonviolent tactics against the British in the early 20th century in Kenya. Nanny used all of these tactics in her battles against the British as the leader of the Maroons. She used guerrilla warfare, spiritual science, oath making, which united the people in their struggle against the British, diplomacy. She used all of these tactics in her battles against the British. So if you chose E, you were correct. Who led the kingdom of Ndongo? That was E, none of the above. That was one of the none of the aboves. And if you wrote Queen Njinga or Queen Nzinga, you would be correct. We're going to talk about Queen Nzinga and Bande in a few weeks. Who led the Marina Kingdom in Madagascar and defeated the English and the French? That was Queen Rana Valona. Queen Rana Valona. And we're going to talk about her in a few weeks. All these people we will go in depth about. The first woman to lead U.S. troops, Harriet Tubman. It was Harriet Tubman. We're going to talk about her Combahee River raid of 1863. One of the most important, 62 or 63, one of the most important military battles of the U.S. Civil War, which she organized and led, and then later on was denied her pension by the U.S. government. So we'll talk about Harriet Tubman's other exploits, other than the ones that we know about. Nehanda Charwe, Kimpavita, Queen Muhamuza, they all used primarily spiritual power. They were able to mobilize people using the power of traditional African religions in Zimbabwe, in Congo, and in Rwanda. So it's spiritual power that they use. And they combined that with military power and political power, but primarily their power was based on their spirituality. The Igbo Women's War, these sisters did all of these things in 1929. They looted factories, they burned down native court buildings, they blocked train tracks, they released prisoners from jail. All of these activities were engaged in 1929. These are just some of the subjects that we're going to touch on over the next 8 weeks. Mark down how many you got right, how many you got wrong, and then at the end of the session, end of the course, we will review this, we'll revisit this, and we'll see how much you have improved. So keep that in your records, the score that you got. You can tell from just this list that we're going to be looking at a wide variety of struggles and events and personalities from North, South, Central, East, West Africa, in the diaspora. We're going to be looking at ancient things, forms of resistance, and we're going to look at modern things, and we're going to connect the two. How continued resistance by African women in 2022 is connected to historical resistance that goes all the way back to recorded history. So we're going to talk about all of that over the next 8 weeks. Oh, wait a minute. There was one more. It's a bonus question. I forgot about this. Dandara, Queen of Angola Jonga, fought to protect the free settlements of Africans in Brazil, known as what? So I'm actually looking for the name of the settlements in Brazil. Is it Sapats? Is it townships? Is it reserves, quilombos, indabas, or none of the above? Just for the sake of time, I'll let you know the answer to this is quilombos. We're going to talk about the quilombos. These were communities of free Africans in Brazil. And these were very similar to the Maroon communities in Jamaica. It's the same concept, just different names. The Spanish called them Cimarrones, runaways. The British took that, shortened it to just Maroons. So in places where the British controlled, they called these settlements where Africans got freedom. And often they were led by women. Women had a lot of political power in Maroon communities, whether we're talking about Jamaica, whether we're talking about Guyana, whether we're talking about in the U.S. with the Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia, or among the Seminole Nation in Florida. You have these communities. Quilombos is what they were called in Brazil. Palenques is what they were called in Colombia and Venezuela and Mexico. So different names for the same phenomena that happened anywhere African people were enslaved. And Dandara was one of the major leaders of the Quilombo of Angola Jonga, the largest Quilombo that we know about, that existed for almost 100 years as a free, independent nation in Brazil. She was the last queen of Angola Jonga, or Little Angola is what that actually means. A couple of key terms for all of our courses. And you'll notice the logo here for the Coppin African Teachers Institute. So whenever you see those young people that are here and they're presenting, they're all a part of this program. and we're constantly raising money for this program. So if you want to donate, you can do that, and there's a mechanism for that. And it doesn't go in my pocket or anything like that. It goes straight to the young people that work in this program that learn to teach African history. So this is what that logo is. And it's named after another great Shero, Fanny Jackson Coppin, who was a principal at the Institute for Colored Youth. That's now Cheney University in the States. She also went to South Africa in the 1890s as part of the AME Church, did a lot of great work in terms of education and activism in South Africa. So and she believed in community education, exactly what we're doing. She believed in that. Sankofa, the idea of looking back at history to learn from it, to move forward in a more just way in the future. That's what we practice. That's why our classes are called Sankofa Community History courses. We practice Sankofa. So that's a key word that you should know. Struggle is another key term. Struggle is nothing to be avoided. Our great ancestor, Frederick Douglass, told us without struggle, there's no progress. So struggle's key. And for this class, we're talking about people struggling against various forms of oppression. We're talking about women, mothers, sisters, daughters, struggling against various forms of oppression. So struggle is a key term in this class. Like I mentioned, Frederick Douglass said, there's no struggle, there's no progress. One little thing about Frederick Douglass. I know we're talking about this class is dedicated to African women, but whenever I show pictures of Frederick Douglass, he never smiles. And there's a reason for that, because there was a belief during enslavement that the South tried to perpetuate, that Black people were happy in slavery and that they were always smiling and singing and all that. So he made it a point not to smile in the pictures, to show that, my people aren't free. We're not happy in this situation. So I'm stern-faced in any picture. And he's one of the most photographed Black people of the 19th century. You never see Frederick Douglass smile, because he's a serious man and he's serious about his struggle. Another key term is agency. Whenever we talk about African history, and this term really was imparted in me through my studies at Temple University with Dr. Malefe Asante. He was my dissertation advisor. We wrote a book together. He's one of my great mentors. But he always stressed agency when we look at African people. Our history is not about what other people have done to us and moved us from place to place. Our history is about our own desire to shape the world into how we want it to be. So agency is key. So especially when we talk about African women are just not appendages of African men that just do whatever men. If you ever been in a relationship with an African woman, or you have an African mother, you know that African women don't do what African men say to do all the time. There's a strong sense of agency, and we have to recognize that in the history. Last key term that we should know, intersectionality. This is a term, the idea of it goes way back to people like Anna Julia Cooper and Claudia Jones and Leila Gonzalez out of Brazil, and so many other African women that were theorists and activists that realized Black women's struggles is not just about race. It's not just about gender, and it's not just about class. It's about all of these things combined. That's intersectionality. Black women have to struggle for against racism, against sexism, and against classism all at the same time, because most Black women are working class people. So intersectionality reminds us that when we review this history, although we're explicit that we're talking about African women, so the race aspect as well as the gender aspect that's clear and prominent in the title, we can never forget about the class aspect. Not all Black women were royalty. Many were working class women, and as we move closer to our time period, we'll see more working class women as the activists really organizing and doing a lot of the work to get us free. Earlier history, yeah, it's a lot of royalty, because that's what survives in the historical record, is usually the upper history of the upper classes. And there's a lot of women in those upper classes that resisted, who we'll talk about. But we can never forget that the majority of African women are working class women. So we always look at that as well. All right, we're going to start the day and start our course in Sudan. We're going to start by talking about a contemporary Shero who is not the sole actor in the latest revolution in Sudan that happened in 2019, but became the face of it, the symbol of it. And this was Ala Salah. Salah is a young woman, engineering student, that when the people of Sudan were finally fed up with the dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir, who had ruled Sudan since the 80s, late 80s, and the people rose up en masse against his government, against his police forces, his military forces, and 70% of those protesters were women. This image of her made international news. They called her a woman in white. She was dressed in this beautiful garb, and she's reciting a poem about oppression and resisting oppression. This goes back to a long history of Sudanese women using their voice, using their power of organization, and occasionally using weapons to fight against various forms of oppression. She's just the current manifestation of this trend that goes back thousands of years. This is Nubia. This is Kush. Sudan is the modern name for that territory that encompasses ancient Nubia, ancient Kush. In written African history, this Nile Valley civilization, alongside its northern neighbor Egypt, are some of the earliest histories that we have on written record. Not the earliest histories that we have, because we got archaeology, we got oral history, but in terms of written record, the history of Nubia, Egypt, Ethiopia, that whole Northeast African region is incredibly important, and women play crucial roles in all three of those civilizations. But we're going to stick today talking about Nubia, Kush. Nubia has a number of different names, and I'm going to use them interchangeably throughout this talk. The most ancient names are Nubia and Kush. So these were the names that the Egyptians called the people that lived to the south, Kush, Nubia. The Greeks called that region Ethiopia. So when I say Ethiopia, I'm not talking about modern day Ethiopia. I'm talking about the area south of Egypt that the Greeks called Ethiopia. So whenever you see Ethiopia in the Bible, they're not talking about modern day nation state of Ethiopia. They're talking about Kush, Nubia. And then of course, the current name is Sudan. So I'll use those interchangeably depending on the time period that I'm talking about. So who was overthrown? That was Omar al-Bashir. And this is to get us situated geographically. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about Sudan. And in 2011, Sudan became two different countries. So you got Sudan, you got South Sudan after many years of civil war. But the information that I'm going to talk about today encompasses largely both nations. A lot of the action is going to center around Khartoum, so it'll make it seem like I'm talking about just Sudan, but a lot of it encompasses both. Very strategic, very important country in Africa. Before the split, it was the largest country in Africa. Now it's the third largest, behind Algeria and the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. Sudan is still the third largest country in Africa in terms of area, geographical area. The Nile Valley goes right between it. Very strategic. And then a large area of its coast is on the Red Sea. So it makes it strategically important. Omar al-Bashir ruled for, over 30 years. Brutal dictator, was really influenced by the idea of Arabization of Sudan, the idea that it's not enough just to be Muslim in Sudan. You have to be like the Arabs. And that was pushed by some of these government officials, many of these government officials, to try to de-Africanize Sudan. So there's a lot about that. But the people finally rose up, and she was one of these people. So, Daniel, if you wouldn't mind, could you play that interview with the BBC with Ala Salah? Or they have this French one, yeah. And I want everybody to pay attention to the first question that's asked by the reporter.
I'm Annette Young, and welcome to the 51%, a show about women reshaping our world. Now, for the last 2 years, we have watched the African nation of Sudan begin its journey towards democracy. However, transitioning from authoritarian rule to democracy inevitably has had its difficulties, with many in the country, especially women's activists, fearing that progress has been far too slow. Ala Salah gained internet fame after images of her leading protest chants against the then President Omar al-Bashir went viral. She's now a committed women's rights activist, and I'm delighted to say joins me in the studio today. We'll be talking shortly, but first Sanam Shantier reports on the courageous woman behind the image.
This was the image that propelled Ala Salah to fame, standing atop a car in a white thobe, reciting a revolutionary poem. The 22-year-old also became a symbol of the push for reform in her country, Sudan, earning the nicknames Lady Liberty and the Woman in White.
The moment I climbed on top of that car, I started to recite a poem. The bullet doesn't kill. What kills is the silence of people. And people react to this poem because it's a very accurate description of what's happening on the streets of Sudan.
It was in 2019 that Salah took part in protests against the nearly 3-decade rule of dictator Omar al-Bashir. At the time, she was an architectural engineering student with little interest in politics. But she decided to fight for change, putting a new perspective on the role of women in shaping the future of the region. She was one of many women who was leading resistance committees and helping to plan sit-ins and demonstrations, often risking tear gas, assault, and prison for their actions. Since 2019, the country has been ruled by a power-sharing civilian military entity. But Salah hasn't stopped calling for change. She's now fighting for equal representation in government so that women are not sidelined as Sudan takes the next steps towards its future.
And watching that report with me is Ala Salah, whose journey has been detailed in this book in French, which has just been published. Ala, thank you so much for coming in and talking to us. What a journey you've been on. But let me start by saying I imagine that there are not too many architectural engineering students in Sudan to begin with. So what made you decide to basically be trained as one?
In fact, there are many women studying architectural engineering. It's not limited to men. We have noticed over the last few years that the presence of girls in the engineering field in general is almost more than boys. Women in Sudan are present in so many fields, be it as students or as workers. They are visible. During the Sudanese revolution, 60% of protesters were women. They were on the front lines too. They also played an important role in our revolution. And this shows how strong and how present women are in Sudan.
Ala, I have to ask you, do you call yourself a feminist?
Not at all. At the beginning, I participated in the revolution, and then I moved on to defending human rights. This is because in Sudan, we do lack the very basic human rights. So what I defend, the cause I believe in, and what I would like to work on is, first of all, education, because it's a fundamental question. There are great women working on the feminist issues, but for me, I want to focus more on education.
All right, pause it, Daniel. Thank you. I just the arrogance of that first question. I don't know if y'all caught that, but there can't be many architectural engineers in Sudan. Why not? Because it's Africa that you have the audacity to ask that question. And I love how she answers like, no, there's a lot. And a lot of them are women because you haven't done your homework and you ask stupid imperial questions like that. But that's who she is. So you got a kind of a sense of who she is. I want to just play one more video. Daniel, if you could, play the other video. This is a conversation. I'm just going to play part of this. between Ala Salah and Alicia Garza. Alicia Garza is one of the three Black American women that started the hashtag Black Lives Matter, the hashtag itself, and were three of the early leaders of that movement that started. So there was a conversation between these two women, and I think that's really important because the same dynamics are in place between Sudan and Black communities all over the world, in that a lot of these protests, a lot of these movements, many of the participants and more, many of the leaders are women, are sisters. So when we look at this current moment in the African world, many of our most revolutionary activists, leaders, organizers are sisters. And it's important that this conversation took place. I'm just gonna play a little bit of it. Go ahead, Dan.
It is interesting to hear from both of you how changing power relations require expressing in various levels, from hashtags to generating international spotlight to on-the-ground coordination and activism that reveals local heroes, builds and maintains the momentum, and continually articulates what power shifts you seek to bring about. But we know that every action provokes a reaction. So, Ala, I'd like to know, in your opinion, what is a statement we heard during the 2019 revolution that says, break the girls, because if you break the girls, you will break the men? What does that mean? And in 2 years since the revolution, can you point to societal shifts in perception and attitudes about the role of women in Sudan?
يمكن تصريح الدولة حطموا الفتيات لأنكم إذا حطمتوهم فأنتم حتحطموا الرجال. إحنا كنا في السودان كنا بنقول صوت المرأة ثورة والثورة مرأة. فإذا بقت الفكرة إنه المرأة هي أساس النضال، هي أساس الثورة. يمكن 65% من المتظاهرين في ثورتنا كانوا هم النساء. فدي حاجة بتورينا إنه مدى القوة اللي عندنا كنساء في السودان. بداية الإعلان الموقف بيكون بزغروطة من البنات. الزغروطة بتحمس أكثر وبتعلن عن بداية انطلاقة الموقف. فبنبدأ على إنه انطلاقة الموقف من زغروطة من مرأة. شوفي يعني دي حاجة بتدينا قوة أكثر. كمان بنقول يعني إذا عايزين نتكلم عن المجتمعات ممكن بتقول إنه مكان المرأة بيتها ومكان المرأة في المطبخ، ويعني دي يعني يمكن حاجات هي مرفوضة بالنسبة لي. بس برضه بنقول إنه شنو؟ فإنه الثورة طلعت من المطبخ اللي هو بيحتوي المرأة، قدر إنه يصنع الثورة بكمية النساء اللي إحنا كنا بنشوفهم، وأنا واحدة منهم كنت في الشارع، فبلقى إنه المرأة ما مكان المطبخ، أو المطبخ في حد ذاته ما كانت تضعف للمرأة، بالعكس قوة بالنسبة لنا. وإذا الثورة بدت من وين وطلعت من وين؟ في المواقف وإحنا بنكون طالعين يعني في نساء أكبر مننا عمرا يمكن ما بيكونوا قادرين إنهم يتحركوا، لأن المواقف بتمشي مسافات طويلة جدا، وفي بعض الأحيان بتكون معرضة للاعتقالات والضرب. فمعانا نساء يمكن ما يقدروا إنهم يتحملوا كل الحاجات دي نظرا لكبر عمرهم، بس بنلقى إنهم بصورة أو بأخرى كانوا معانا في المواقف، خصوصا في فترة اللي اتنقلت فيها المواقف من المواقف المركزية لمواقف المدن والأحياء. فبنلقى إنه أماتنا أو النساء يعني باعتبار إنهم أمات بالنسبة لنا بيكونوا واقفين في الشوارع مجهزين مثلا موية أو بيقدموا لنا الحاجة المتوفرة في مطبخهم عشان ما يدعمونا ونقدر نواصل في طريقنا للموقف وفي طريقنا يعني في الحاجة اللي إحنا بنعمل فيها. فكل واحدة بتحاول تكون معانا باللي هي بتقدر فيه. فبنلقى إنه المطبخ بتاعه هو يعني الحاجة اللي قدمتها لنا من المطبخ هي خلتها تشارك معانا في الثورة، رغم إنهم كبر عمرها أو عدم قدرتها لإنها تتحرك معانا مسافات طويلة. بس برجع وبقول إنه إحنا في الثورة أدوارنا كانت تكاملية بمختلف أعمارنا بمختلف ثقافاتنا. فالما قادر إنه يمشي فكان بصوته، الما كان يعني كان بصوته بعطائه بقدرة يعني بالمقدرة بتاعته الجسمانية على إنه يتحرك، أو الشباب في إنهم كيف يقدروا يرجعوا عبوات البومبان للقوات النظامية كيف يقدروا يصدوا لجان التأمين اللجان الطبية لجان التخطيط فكلها كانت أدوار بالنسبة لنا تكاملية قدرنا من خلالها نقدر نصنع الثورة العظيمة دي فبنلقى إنه حتى النساء اللي هم ربات البيوت كانوا معانا وكانوا جزء من الثورة دي فبنرجع وبنقول إنه صوت المرأة ثورة إذا أنت ضبيت يعني إذا معنى كلامه إذا أنت حطمت
Thought I was talking, it was muted. Yeah, that is the key in Sudan, that women were the revolution, just like Salah mentioned. So, what has happened since 2019? The government in Sudan has reverted back to military rule. At first, it was the Sovereign Council of Sudan. But last year, around this time last year, the military took over again. So the people are protesting again and fighting for a new constitution that will bring things back to civilian rule. But originally on the Sovereign Council, you had sisters that sat on it. But this has since been dissolved. And now different factions in the country are fighting to create a new constitution. And one group, a group of women met a few days ago, 40 women met a few days ago to craft their own version of what they want to see in the Constitution that respects women's rights, concerning education, concerning culture, concerning so many different things. So this is an ongoing process in Sudan. It's an ongoing struggle, and women are front and center in it, in the streets, in the revolutionary planning committees, all with the desire to see Sudan develop. A couple of things that she mentioned that I'll bring up, and then we'll go to our first Q&A. She talked about the role of voice and women using their voices to create songs, chants, poetry. This is an old aspect of Sudanese culture. It's an old aspect of most African cultures. We know how important the voice is in oral poetry and oral history and oral communication. So these women, such as in western part of Sudan and near Darfur, you got the hakama, that, or the hakamat in the plural. These are women who traditionally have had the role of adjudicating disputes between men. They also have the role of encouraging people to go to war. More recently, however, their role has transitioned to being the voices of peace in their community. Because for a long time, these were the women that convinced men to go out to go fight, which is, there's some valor in that. They would valorize men for their bravery. They would ridicule men that were cowards. But in the 80s, 90s, because of climate change, you had a lot of intercommunal violence in Darfur that then became genocidal violence when the government got involved and people started relying on religion to be an organizing factor in the destruction of others because they're fighting over environmental problems. These women would have young men that were fighting for in their communities. They would encourage them to fight. Excuse me. And since then, since the 90s, these women have now transformed their message into one of peace. And they are given special privilege in the society to say things that other women and other people can't. They use poetry, improvised poetry. So almost like freestyle rapping in a way. And they sing in these groups where one person says something and they're backed up by the chorus, and they go from community to community, encouraging people toward peace. So we see this even going back to the fight against the British, and one of the great figures of Sudanese history, Hawa al Taga. Taga is a nickname that was given to her either by the British or by other Sudanese because of the melodic quality of her voice. Sounds like a particular tree, and she was given this name. She would use songs and poetry in her organizing against British colonialism in Sudan. She was jailed She was attacked by the British, but she would not stop the singing. She would not stop organizing. She would not stop inspiring the people. And you see her actually, if this was in color, this is the flag, the original flag of Sudan that she's wrapped in. And she would encourage the people. She would organize, all fighting against the British. She's one of the great heroes of Sudan. So this idea of using the voice as an instrument of protest, an instrument of inspiration to get the people going, to organize them, goes a long way back in Sudan. We're going to go even further back. So we're kind of starting at the present, and we're going to go back all the way to ancient times in Sudan. But we'll take a break right now for any questions that folks may have. So are there any questions in the chat, Daniel, or does anybody want to raise your hand and ask a question? Any questions? Daniel, you see anything in the chat?
No, there's nothing in the chat.
Any hands? Anybody have a question? You can raise your hand. If not, I'll keep going. No hands? All right, let's keep going then. All right, so speaking of the rebellions against the British, this goes all the way back. Sudan was colonized by the British in the late 1800s, very brutal colonization. The British used their most advanced weapons of destruction at the time against the Sudanese, mowed down a lot of them in various military campaigns, a lot of brutality. Controlled the region because they wanted to control the Nile River. They weren't the first invaders into Sudan. You also had the Turks who came, the Ottomans who controlled Egypt, and then came down and tried to control Sudan. They were led by a guy named Muhammad Ali, the Pasha Muhammad Ali. He was an Albanian, I think, he was an Albanian mercenary that the Ottomans had used to try to enslave Africans, essentially. His goal was to enslave Africans, to put them in the army of the Ottomans. And many Africans from Sudan ended up in, and from Egypt, ended up in the armies of the Ottomans. And some ended up enslaved in Turkey. There's a big Afro-Turk population, and many of them are Sudanese. But even during all of that struggle, the sisters were there protesting. The mothers were there protesting, using their voice, encouraging their men to fight and not be cowards and to fight against colonizers. Let me get the... Throughout that period of colonization, first from the Ottoman Turks and then to the British, women mobilized. Women got themselves educated. You have women such as Fatima, Ahmed, Ibrahim, one of the most influential Sudanese women activists of the 20th century. She fought against the British in the 40s and 50s, nonviolently, organizing people to resist British colonialism. When Sudan gets independence in 1956, she's a member of the Sudanese Communist Party. And she organizes, even before Sudan gets independence, in 1952, the Sudanese Women's Union. It was a union that stretched from the north to the south throughout. It's one of the few organizations in Sudanese history before the Civil War that included people from both the north and the south. This women's union brought housewives together, women academics together, and everybody, women farmers together to talk about their issues as women and how they could fight for both independence and for a new future in Sudan where women's rights would be respected. Women could get education, they could get property rights, they can get political participation in government. In fact, Fatima Ibrahim becomes one of the earliest African women in a parliament, in the national parliament, when she gets elected to parliament in 1964. Sudan gets independence in 56, and it's a democracy for a couple of years, and then there's a military coup in 1958. A military coup that is sponsored, of course, by our good friends at the CIA, because of the territorial importance of Sudan, and because of how vital the Nile River is, and also its access to the Red Sea, the U.S. did not want Sudan to fall within the communist sphere of influence. So when Egypt became revolutionary, the U.S. didn't want the domino effect to happen. So the Eisenhower administration sponsored a military coup in Sudan that replaced a government that did not want U.S. aid, that did not want U.S. military assistance, with a military government that was essentially beholden to the U.S. She continued to fight and organize women to fight against that, because she realized that we got the British out, and now the Americans are coming in, and although they're not colonizing us, they're not saying that you're no longer an independent nation, they've essentially turned us into a neo-colony. This is in 1958. This is as many African countries were beginning in the 1960s to get independence. The US, France, Britain would often interfere if the new leaders stressed African nationalism, if they stressed Pan-Africanism, if they stressed using African resources for African people. Then you saw a lot of these military coups happen, and they always were resisted. And many of the resistance leaders were African women such as Fatima, Ibrahim. So she organized women. Eventually, another revolution happened and got that military regime out. And in 1964, she's actually elected to parliament. Then there's another coup a while later. She's forced underground. She's forced to actually go into exile. But she, along with women such as Awadia Abbas, continued to organize underground. They used the networks that the military men wouldn't think about. There were collectives of women farmers and housewives collectives that weren't seen as political, because some of these men couldn't contemplate that these women would be revolutionary activists. They're just housewives meeting to talk about whatever housewives talk about. But they were an underground organization of women's rights activists and human rights activists. Awadia Abbas, the woman here on the left, the trade union activist, began her activism in the 1960s as a seamstress, and helped unionize the seamstress industry in Sudan, and was also a member of the Sudanese Communist Party, and worked with Fatima Ibrahim and the Sudanese Women's Union. This is one of the most revolutionary women's organizations in Africa. They met with other African women's organizations from Ghana, from Guinea, from Congo, and the Pan-African Women's Federation, where they talked about what was going on with African women on the continent and how they could support each other. So these are icons. She's actually still alive. Fatima Ibrahim passed away a couple of years ago, but Abbas is still alive and still is active. So because our organization had to go underground in the 1970s when another military regime came in and they outlawed the Sudanese Women's Union and some of these other organizations, she could no longer be a trade union activist. So eventually she takes a job as a vendor on the streets, selling tea, selling food. And in the 1990s, she begins unionizing those women, which was a dangerous assignment that she took on. So by the time we get to 2019, she's still active as a vendor, as a food seller. And these were some of the main women that Salah was talking about, these older women that supported the revolution. Although they might not have been able to walk to the marches, they provided food, they provided inspiration through their songs, through their chanting. She was one of those women. So she was able to connect activism that started in the 1960s all the way to 2019, staying active, encouraging the young people, teaching them the lessons of organizing. These are Sheroes. This is an everyday person. This is somebody you would have passed on the street in Khartoum. You would have seen her selling tea, selling food from her market. And these women were often attacked by the police and before they unionized and she organized them, and they were extorted. And now they're one of the most powerful groups in the country because they're in the streets. They're connecting with young people. They're connecting with the protesters. They're connecting with the folks that, and they are some of the leaders making the change. So she's still alive. She's still active. Fatima Ibrahim passed away, but they represented the same type of energy and movement that Salah represents now. They're the mothers of this. But it goes back even further. It goes back even further to ancient times. And this is where we'll kind of wrap up in a second. This is where Kush was. The big outline was Sudan. Kush is inside of Sudan, it's northern Sudan. This is the same area called Nubia, what the Greeks called Ethiopia. So it's here that we have one of the largest proportions of female and most powerful female rulers in ancient Africa. So this is where all this energy originates from. The Kendakes of Kush, the female leaders of Nubia. So again, this is just another a map that shows you at its height, the Kush Empire during the year 700 BCE controlled Egypt and even up into Palestine. This was the area, this was the time of leaders such as Taharka, who's mentioned in the Bible, such as Shabaka and others who took Nubian territory all the way up into Egypt, and they were called the 25th dynasty. One of my colleagues and another mentor of mine, Virgilette Gaffin, who works at Cheney University. She's an African-American woman that spends a lot of her summers in Egypt doing excavations. She teaches African history and African literature, but she also is bringing this history to us through her work with archaeological digs in Egypt, in the Nile Valley. And she studies this time period where the Nubians controlled Egypt. But anyway, Nubia was a very powerful ancient nation, controlled the Nile River. It was a nation incredibly rich in mineral wealth, in gold, in luxury goods. And a number of its leaders were strong women, particularly when the capital moved to this place here called Merowe. The evidence that we have for this, if you're interested in how we know this history, the written record. Meta-Necha, the ancient Egyptians talked about Nubia, of course. We know a lot about Nubia from that. There's a Nubian script. When the capital moved to Merowe, there was a development of the Merowitic script. The problem with this is we have a bunch of it. We have a number of books and tablets and wall inscriptions all in this script, but it has yet to be deciphered. So we don't know what it means. We can make out the sounds of it based off of certain analysis, but we don't know what the words mean yet. So this is still an ongoing historical puzzle. Once this gets deciphered, we'll know even more about Nubian history. So that's an ongoing project. The Axumites, what's now Ethiopia, they wrote about Sudan, and Ge'ez, the Phoenicians, wrote about Sudan. Sudan is Nubia is mentioned in the Bible, so it's Hebrew, Greek, Latin. All of these various written sources talk about Nubia. Of course, there's Nubian oral history. There's archaeology that takes us way back for us to see what was going on in Nubia. There's linguistic evidence, of course, botanical evidence as well. Just a little side note, there's a whole lot of pyramids in Sudan. There are more pyramids in Sudan than there are in Egypt, but they're smaller. That's the only thing. They're smaller, but there's a lot more of them, and you can see the remnants of it. And this perfectly shows you the impact of climate change. Because one of the things in ancient times that separated Nubia from Egypt, this was green. Egypt was always desert. Not always. I mean, there was a time, ancient times, where parts of Egypt were even green. But Nubia was always greener than Egypt. It was savanna. So that is one of the reasons why these civilizations were slightly different. Egypt was much more centralized. Nubia wasn't so centralized because the king couldn't have direct control over people the way that the pharaohs could in Egypt, because people could only live on, a few miles on each side of the Nile River. That's where most of the population, as well as the Delta, is where people lived in Egypt. In Nubia, there was a lot of grassland, so people could move around. So if you didn't like what the king was doing, you didn't have to listen to the king, because you could just move somewhere else. There was a lot more land, a lot more people were nomadic. They were pastoralists because they had herds that could eat the grass and they could sustain off of that. So now, though, with the expansion of sand, you can kind of see it in this image. Before climate change, this all would have been the green that you see in the sparse areas here where you see a little bit of green, this all would have been green. So this is also leading to a lot of the problems in Sudan right now. Throughout that entire Sahel region of Africa, we've mentioned this several times. Because the Sahara is advancing, there's less grassland for pastoralists. They start fighting with farmers over the limited access to land and water. Then that devolves into religious conflicts that we're seeing all over Africa. So that's a huge problem that we should keep in mind. But anyway, this land used to be called Taseti, land of the bow. That's what the Egyptians called the Nubians, because they were so proficient as archers and as warriors that they called Nubia, among other things, Taseti. Ta meaning land, Seti meaning bow, so land of the bow. And you can see Egyptian figurines that depict Nubian warriors from ancient times. All right, last key term we'll talk about, then we'll start to close up, the Kendakes, the female monarchs of ancient Nubia. So whenever you see the word Kendake or you see the name Candace, so if you take this K, turn it to a C, take that K and turn it to a C, you get the name Candace. A lot of people have that name, and it comes from Kendake, because in the Bible it's written as Candace, almost as if it's a personal name, but it's not a personal name, it's a title. So Kendake, the female monarchs of Nubia. Mentioned in the Bible, like I said, in Acts, there's this story of the conversion of the deacon Philip's conversion. It's on the road from Jerusalem to Gaza. An Ethiopian, a eunuch, a minister of Candace, the queen of Ethiopians, in charge of all her treasures. So the Philip converts this guy who is a minister of one of the Kendakes, in charge of all of her treasures. So this short passage in the Bible talks a lot about the powers of these queens, because this whole episode takes place somewhere in Palestine, on the road from Jerusalem to Gaza. So what this is saying is this queen has a minister, a eunuch, and we talked about eunuchs a couple weeks ago. So these were people that, men that were castrated and put in the service of royalty for various reasons. But in this case, he's serving as a minister in charge of her finance. So she has business dealings all the way in Palestine. That means she has a global trade network that she's in charge of, and all of her treasures. And she's doing business up in Palestine. So although this is really about, this guy's conversion, that short little passage tells us just about the power of these women. Some of the more famous ones, Queen, they have these, it's long names, so I have to look at the pronounce. Shandaka Kete, a queen, Amani Shaketo. You see the images of these women here, these powerful women. They started depicting themselves in the Egyptian style because Nubia and Egypt shared cultural traits, and they sometimes they shared even gods, the name of God. Like when you see Aman or Amani in Nubian names, it's because they shared the god Aman as the high god in Egypt as well as the high god in Nubia. That would change after some time, but you see that. The most famous queen, and we talked about her in previous classes, the Kendaki Amani Reyness, and we'll close with this today. Just like Allah Salah defended the Sudanese people against repressive regime of Omar al-Bashir, just as Fatima Ibrahim defended the Sudanese women against colonialism and neo-colonialism, just as Hawa Taga defended the Sudanese women against British colonialism, and so many other women defended Sudan against Turkish invasion and Egyptian invasion. She defended her kingdom of Nubia from Roman invasion right before the turn of the first millennium. So she fought against the forces of Emperor Augustus. And unlike Augustus, and Augustus has his own history. He was the first emperor of Rome. He's the great nephew of Julius Caesar. His uncle gave him the empire, gave him his blessing when he died, when he was stabbed up in the Roman Senate. He fights against Mark Antony and Mark Antony's wife, Cleopatra. and he eventually takes over Egypt as well as everything else you see in yellow. He's one of the most powerful men in the world at this time. He's the first emperor of Rome. But he realizes that Nubia is the real prize in the region. Now, Egypt is a prize. Egypt was a breadbasket of the ancient world. Egypt produced a lot of grain. They had great farming techniques. A lot of grain was produced that could feed Rome and feed some of these other places in the Mediterranean world. But he soon learned that Nubia is where all the riches were. The gold, the ostrich feathers, which were prized in the ancient world. A lot of other luxury items, hardwoods, because there were a lot of trees still in Nubia at the time. Frankincense and myrrh. Those things were really expensive, and they were coming out of Nubia. So the Romans said, we should conquer Nubia next. The traditional separation between Nubia and Egypt is something called the First Cataract. So if you imagine the Nile Valley as a highway, there's certain tolls, and cataracts are these rocky areas in the Nile River that kind of serve as boundaries on certain parts of the Nile. You can't really navigate them by boat. You have to go around. So the First Cataract is always considered the boundary between Nubia and Egypt. And if you cross the First Cataract, you're invading Nubia. So the Romans set their troops up right above the First Cataract, and the Nubians could see that they were amassing their troops. Queen Amani-Reines could see this, and she was abreast of what was going on geopolitically. She knew that the Romans had taken over Egypt, and they probably would have their sights on Nubia, because the Nubians in Egypt and the Egyptians had been at war various times. Like I mentioned, the Nubians had conquered Egypt. There were times where Egypt had conquered Nubia. So they knew what was up. So while his troops were amassing, and when I say his troops, his generals, he was not much of a military guy. He was a philosopher. He was sickly a lot. He's in Rome. You know, he sends his generals to fight his battles. She's on the front line. And so we can already see the difference between these two leaders. She sees his troops amassing. She doesn't wait for them to get completely set up so they can invade her country. She goes on the offensive and attacks the Romans. She crosses the cataract, attacks the Romans, fights them to a standstill, fights the most powerful land army in the region to a standstill, where they're forced to sue for peace, and they don't invade Nubia. One of the Roman scholars that wrote a history of this back in the day, he told the story that during one of the attacks, her forces were able to capture a bust of Emperor Augustus and took that bust and buried it underneath the entryway to her palace. That way, every time she woke up, she could walk over Emperor Augustus to show that he's under her feet. A lot of times, back in the day, historians thought that this was just something the Romans made up, that it wasn't real, that this didn't actually happen, until archaeologists excavated her palace, and lo and behold, they found the head from a statue of Emperor Augustus. So it was true. The Romans also wrote other things about her. I mean, they were quite negative, but even in their negativity, they couldn't deny how powerful this woman was. They said she was on the front Europeans do to try to denigrate African people. They said that she kept pet lions, and that she only had one eye because she lost one of them in battle. So all of this was said about her, but they couldn't deny the fact that she had defeated the Romans in battle. At least it was a draw, which means she probably defeated them, but the Roman chroniclers just said, okay, it was a draw, and we all decided. She probably just beat them so bad that they said, we don't want no parts of Nubia, which is something that would come back again, because the Nubians also defeated the Arabs that tried to invade Nubia much later on. There were women involved in that battle as well. So Queen Amani-Reines sets the trend for these Nubian, Sudanese women that we see all the way up into present time. These are the types of stories that we're going to be talking about over the next 8 weeks. So make sure you're here. Make sure you're engaging with this. You're engaging with the course website, sharing this information with others, and we'll stop there for the day. Remember, there's no class next week. There's no class next week. I'll be celebrating my son's first birthday, so we won't have class next week. But we'll pick up the week after, talking more stories of resistance and powerful African women. So we'll stop there for the day, and I'll open it up to any questions or comments. So, Daniel, are there any hands up, or is there anything in the chat?
I don't see anything in the chat. Kamaria, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I am really curious about, this is the first time that I've heard you talk about Nubia as Ethiopia, referred to as Ethiopia. That's really interesting to me, that there seems to be some, that's going to be really confusing to decipher between the two whenever we see that in literature, to differentiate. And you kind of did a little bit, because that was going to be my question. How can we tell when the Bible is referring to Nubia and not the actual modern day Ethiopia? And then you brought up the verse about Kandake. So I'm wondering if they were referring to Kandake from Ethiopia, i.e. Nubia, then that changes a lot, because then we're thinking about, even when they refer to, there's another verse in the Bible that says you can't change a tiger stripes or something like that, anymore than you can change Ethiopians, I think, skin color, something like that.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, are they talking about Sudan there?
They're probably talking about Sudan.
Yeah. And even the time you mentioned, when the verse that says when Ethiopia stretches out his hand, and referring to the conquering of, when the British came to Ethiopia, the modern day Ethiopia, maybe that verse is referring to Sudan.
It probably is. It gets complicated, because so the term Ethiopia is a Greek term meaning land of the burnt faces. Now, and they weren't saying that derogatory. That's just how they, and it was, in fact, the Greeks were quite complimentary of Ethiopia. They say Ethiopia is the resting place, as a vacation spot of the gods. They wasn't a derogatory thing. They just say these people are darker than us, so the land of the burnt faces. It's like black people have a term called Oyimbo, which means it's a term that Yoruba use for white people, which just means like if your skin has been I don't know exactly what it means. What does it mean? Your skin has been like peeled off or something like that. But it's not necessarily derogatory. It's just when you look at somebody that's
literal.
Yeah. So what it meant for the Greeks was anything south of Egypt was Ethiopia. So technically, what's now Ethiopia, it could be considered Ethiopia, but more precisely what they're talking about is Nubia or Kush, is what they're referring to. So when you see it in the Bible, they're talking about that. Now, when you see things written about Aksum and Abyssinia, then they're talking about what's now Ethiopia. When you see Abyssinia, that was the name for the region that you'll see in literature in the 18th and 19th and even early 20th century. Later on in the 20th century, actually starting in the 19th century, Ethiopia becomes the name that's used for that kingdom more so than Abyssinia. But there's a time where you'll see both of them. But it's kind of like what happens with Ghana. So ancient Ghana is up here, but when the Gold Coast got independence, the leaders decided we're going to change the name to Ghana in recognition of this great empire that was further to the north. And there are some historical connections between the people that live in the Gold Coast, what was then the Gold Coast in Ghana, but really that region had never been called Ghana. They chose that name to honor another place further north. So when we look at Ethiopia, it used to be called Abyssinia. It used to be the Aksum Empire was the most dominant area here. That name, and I'm not sure exactly when historically that name gets placed on Abyssinia, on Aksum, but when the people that were writing the Bible were writing, and they wrote Ethiopia, they're thinking about Kush and Nubia. That's what's front and center in their mind whenever you see Ethiopia in the Bible. So yeah, it gets kind of confusing, but that's the best way to describe that. Other questions?
Norma, go ahead.
Thanks so much. Very interesting to know our roots in the civil rights movement for women, and know how germane, how they were able to go around the mountains. Just before the pandemic, I was privileged to actually do a tour of Egypt and go down the Nile, and actually went over to the Nubia, and actually I went with some family members and my brother. They kept thinking that he was Egyptian, and it just goes to show that even in migration, we come back to our roots, and it reminds me of other slaves, women slaves, who continued even here in North America to fulfill or engage in human rights. And the 19th century woman that brings me to mind is Sojourner Truth.
Mm-hmm.
And that beautiful poem of hers, Ain't I a Woman? And, you know, it's the Women's Rights Convention that she, you know, basically told everybody this this poem. She wasn't educated, but it was flowing more than most people who were educated. So it's nice to have this presentation to see how far back women went in human rights, and also how the very creative ways they went around the mountains to see. So really enjoyed this session. I missed the session last year on the Sheroes, so I'm looking forward to the rest of the sessions. Thanks very much, Clyde.
Thank you for that. Yes, we're going to get into that. That's a very important speech poem that Sojourner Truth did, and it shows kind of a historic. It was really interesting in the video that we watched when the woman asked Salah, is she a feminist? And she said no. And you'll get that answer from a lot of African women rights activists, because they don't want that label put on them, because there's a history with feminism, and sometimes it's a history of racial exclusion. It's a history of not hearing Black people's problems. And that's what Sojourner Truth was pointing out. When these women are having this conversation at this women's convention, and they're not really speaking to the experience of Black women, she has to interject and say, wait, ain't I a woman? Like, you guys are talking about we want to get into the workplace. We were brought here to work. You know, you're talking about, you know, yeah, we don't want to have the luck. We don't want to just sit home and do it. We don't have that option. We have to take care of our families and work and do all this. So there's a class element, there's a race element, and we're going to get into all that when we talk about Layla Gonzalez a little bit later. We might talk about Assata Shakur and others in the Black Power movement that had this critique. So we're going to get into a lot of that. So yeah, so thank you for bringing that up. Any other questions, Daniel, before we close out?
There is a question in the chat. Somebody asked, will we have access to the recordings, and where does one start to learn a basic introductory of this history to share with my children? Yes, so on the course website, all the recordings will be posted. And if you signed up for the class, I have your email. I'll make sure everybody gets, and if you got the email announcing this class, the link to the course website is there. So you will have access to that. It's a growing website. We're about to migrate
to a different platform. I'll let you know when we do that, and I will send out the link for that because we're going to upgrade. But all that stuff is there. All that stuff will remain there. In the course website, there is a document somewhere near the beginning called, it's a UNESCO, it was something that was compiled by UNESCO, and it is a picture book of a lot of the women that we're going to talk about in this class. And it has a beautiful cartoon image of them, as well as a write-up about what it is that they did. So you can use that as a starting point. And it's really designed for I would say elementary and middle school students. I mean, adults can learn a lot from it too. But it has an image of the woman, and then it talks about what it is that they did. That's a good source, and that's available on the course website as well. I'll think of some other ones that are nice general sources, but that's the first one that comes to mind. So yeah, we have that for you if you want to start using it to talk to young people. Yeah. All right, everybody. So we'll close up for today. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Clyde, just before you close, just a corollary from that, you had promoted a course for children 5 and older last year. Is that course still going on?
We haven't done it since last year. It's funny because Kamaria is on, who facilitated that course for Jaku Convent. We haven't done that this year. We haven't even really discussed it. So we'll keep you updated if we run that again. But I'll let you know. Yeah, that's really interesting that you brought that up, because yeah, Sister Kamaria did a great job with that. A lot of activities for the youth. It's a great program. But yeah, things been moving around a lot. So we'll let you know if that's happening again.
Okay, because my grandchildren, at least the 2 of the 3, weren't old enough to take it last year, but 3 of them turned 5 this year. So
okay.
Yeah, I think the more we can entrench our youth into our history, which we never got going to school, that will help with the systemic and cultural change that we need here in North America.
Definitely. And as always, if you know any high school students that are interested in doing this type of work, you can always forward them to me as well, because we're always looking for teaching apprentices. And we'll probably be running another program for high school students soon. So I have to double check with the Youth Services Bureau next week. So there might be another, you might see some young people in a couple of weeks doing some work. And then in February, there'll be an even bigger program that I'll let you all know about that's being constructed. So I'll keep you all updated on these things. Everybody enjoy your families this weekend with the day off on Monday. Remember, no class next week, but we reconvene on the 22nd. So I'll see everybody then. Stay safe.